Okay, well, I expected there to be, the room would clear out. The gravitas level just went down about 6 notches compared to the last speaker. Well, first of all, before I start talking this evening, I wanted to thank you for your encouragement of me and the campers this week. It's been our biggest camp yet. You might have heard me talk about. We've had 155 plus campers here. This is our 7th one with Dr. Erb. And as I was telling the Psalm Tap participants yesterday, there's just something about being on this campus this week with students who are working hard, playing hard, enjoying one another. You hear motives and fragments of Bach, Dona nobis pacem in the hall and Praetorius. It's a lot of fun. You hear that as you walk down the hall, and it's been great. Even if sometimes the smell on the olfactory organ of you teenagers with a basketball game fresh, you're wearing it back into a choir rehearsal. We smell that. It's okay. We still love you. The eyes and the ears have been refreshed, even if the nose wasn't. But thank you for your encouragement. It's been a lot of fun. And as I count, and Emily, you have to correct me. Thank you, Emily, for all your work. But I count 7 states represented in our camp. And that's just campers. So it's really been neat. And then David and John, thank you for your willingness to come and do this weird thing called the Bach Lectures in West Monroe, Louisiana last year. And thanks for bringing Bach into focus through his music and life in both helpful and enjoyable ways. So let me open with prayer, and then we'll get started. Our Father, we thank you for your mercy to us, your great, generous gifts of music and art, and how you just put it in front of us and give us only a small taste. We ask that you would help us this evening to focus, to enjoy, to really be encouraged, that you would guide my words and guide our discussion here, that it would be a blessing to us and an honor to you and what we do and say. Thank you for this week, and thank you for your provision over us. And we ask that you would bless our time now for Jesus' sake. Amen. Okay, so why am I up here and not John Hodges again? Well, that is really the question of the evening. I realized that I wanted to talk a little bit. I take my cues, I'd taken what Uri said in the Psalm Tap. He said, his congregation, takes on his personality. Well, tonight I think I'm taking on a little of Steve's personality in that for every conference I can remember for the longest time, Steve would always get the last slot. He would bat cleanup, although, good Atlanta Braves fan that he is, he would bat cleanup. So I thought, I'm not batting cleanup per se, but what I thought I would do is kind of bring the Bach lectures to bear on our music camp for you. I realize I often get to speak elsewhere, and you get to hear me in fragments, but sometimes I'm sure you wonder, what is the vision that we're doing here? Why does Mr. Richey do that? And the short answer is, I don't always know. But the long answer is, there is a method to my madness. So I wanted to go over some of that for you here. I wanted to talk about the reason that we look to Bach, and how I wanted to talk about through the lens of music literacy and how that can help us. Our school and our church, we've taken some of these traits that you have probably noticed yourself in Bach's life, and I wanted to highlight a few of those. They're by no means exhaustive, but I thought it would be helpful to rehearse those this evening. The first time I got to sing music by Bach was in my senior year of college. I was privileged to sing the Bach 150, cantata, Nach der Herr verlanget mich, for thee, O Lord, I long, or more literally, you are asking for me, Lord, or oh, Lord, you're asking for me. But before that, my experience of cantata, as maybe some of yours was the evangelical Christmas church cantata, written somewhere by a publishing company out of Nashville in the last 20, 30 years at the time. And for me, prior to that, I hadn't really understood what this Bach phenomenon was. There was no real mystical experience, I'm not going to stand before you and say. about that first time singing Bach for me. Instead, there was really a richness that I didn't quite understand or couldn't put the words to. For you see, in our college choir, we were singing with ULM. We were doing a joint one-and-one, home-and-home performance, and we were singing this. But I sensed even then that there was an elite status of saying we've sung Bach, right? It was more that than it was a love by our director. Although I don't doubt that Bach's music was loved by our faculty and the players that played them. But as you well know, and our students and campers know this week, Bach's not easy. It's not easy for us moderns to sing Bach. Even though, as Dr. Erb said last night, I think very convictingly, his music, in a sense, was and should be, at least if we do our jobs right, children's music. These were the youth that sung under his tutelage. But Bach's music is hard for our culture to ascend because we don't have the required music literacy needed to perform Bach's music in the way that it should be performed. It doesn't mean you have to perform it exactly that way. There's plenty to be said on that. But I want you to imagine, students particularly, imagine the work that you've done, the music that this week, if it was a regular week where we did the concert on Sunday instead of Saturday, and Dr. Erb was writing new settings of the music this week. This was not, stuff that we were pulling from elsewhere. And he was intersplicing, his composition with pre-existing hymn or chorale tunes from hundreds of years before that the church had sung, that you would know, stuff we'd sung in here. Imagine doing this week in and week out, right? Imagine the work you're putting in this week, and then like a little, do it again. Read the book again, right? Next week, do it all over again. Some of you would probably say, sure. To which Dr. Erb would say, as I'm sure he's exhausted, as I know you are too. But the reality is that there's a breakneck speed that's required for this week and a rigor to these rehearsals that are a result of trying to close the gap of music literacy, in a sense, give you a taste and a joy for music and ability to serve that frankly, in Bach's day, was commonplace. So you wouldn't get a week or a semester to learn music. You would get the music wet ink in some cases. And some of his own students would be responsible for copying out the scores for the players. So a week turnover, we don't have that in our culture. We can't sustain that. Thanks be to God, that we have Bach's example, but that's got to be where we want to go. We want to be able to do that in the future. We don't want to be content to stay where we are, but we've got to do a lot of work in the area of music literacy. So what I thought I would do is highlight some traits or qualities. I'm not entirely sure I like the word traits, but hopefully you'll indulge me for the sake of what I'm trying to get at, to help us see music literacy through Bach's life. We can't spend too long on it. We've got to move on, but a few things hopefully that'll draw you to ways we should be if we want to be musically literate, both in our church life and our school life. Hopefully you'll be able to amen these and probably are noticing your students taking this up, at least if we're doing good work and the Lord's blessing it. The first of these, I'll jump right in, is thankfulness. Those of you in this room have probably heard me more than once say just how much of Bach's musical catalog is based on pre-existing text and tune. You don't need to look very much farther than the 140, probably one of the top known cantatas, the Wacht auf, the Wake Awake for Night is Flying, which is a Philip Nicolai hymn tune that's hundreds of years old, I believe, beyond Bach when he set that in a cantata. We performed here the Bach 4, the Christlag and Todesbanden, which is built off of Luther's paraphrase of Christ ist erstanden, which was also itself built upon the 11th century Victime Pascale Laudes, the 11th century chant there. So that list even goes further to some of my favorites, the 79 and the 192, which are the hymn Nun danket alle Gott, the Now Thank We All Our God, which Martin Rinkert wrote in 1636, which was a Reformation table hymn. These things are, of course, pale probably to the Mighty Fortress, the Bach 80, the Ein Festebourg cantata that Bach wrote. What's interesting to note is arguably the greatest composer, as I began to listen, Bach, and study his catalog, didn't start from scratch. Arguably the greatest composer to ever live didn't start from scratch. If ever there was a church musician who had probably the equity to start from scratch, but he didn't. And that's something I think that we need to adapt. As Christians who seek to anchor our children and ourselves in the faith that is so richly given to us, we need to not miss this virtue. There's a required thankfulness that you must have, and also a knowledge that you've got to have of what's come before. That's very antiquated in our society. But Bach was pardon this expression, but he was a bastion of thankfulness where we are not. We are build the new building and do not glorify the old one. Bach was study the architecture, if you mind my mixing of analogies here, and glorify the existing edifice. Build on it, add layers, work and glorify it, if that helps you see that. But that proceeds from thankfulness. And I would like to argue that Bach and previous generations thrived in thankful awareness of what had come before them. And I also think that some of the greatest treasures in Western music, as a result, have been produced. So what's fascinating about this is you might know the name of Bach, and in the German translates to what? Who knows? I'm sure John and David and others might know. What is Bach, B-A-C-H, Bach, translate? What would be the loose translation into English? You know? Don't be shy. Small what? Brook. Did someone say brook or river or stream? Somebody did. We'll give you credit to this side. Points will be awarded. Right? Yes. Small stream, small river. And when you think about it, it seems quite fitting to me that the Lord would channel such a musical excellence from a man who died, but all but forgotten until, 100 years after his death. It seems that this little brook himself was downstream from the Reformation and was a current that has just flowed all over the world and back again. It seems a fun play on words, for Bach was the grandson, or a grandson of the Reformation, you could say. He was even born in Eisenach, where Luther was reared in his younger years. He was raised in the church, and we would probably today in our circles label him a student of a classical Christian education, raised in classical Christian schooling. In fact, it's Jaroslav Pelikan says that music occupied a fifth of the course time and theology another 1/5, on the principle that it was the purpose of the curriculum to combine music and theology in promoting piety and building character. Calvin Stapert talks about in Haydn's day, in Papa Haydn's day, that they would go home for lunch and they would come back, and then they would study music and read for the rest of the afternoon. It was not going through the motion. Bach should not be discounted for being a grandson of the Reformation. Even in his older years, we know that Bach's faith was evident to him, his Bible knowledge, this trait of being a grandson of the Reformation, being someone steeped in God's Word, was evident. You probably have heard the story that of the Calov Bible commentary. Luther's translation of the German Bible was Abraham Calov had a commentary which somehow ended up and sold, as a lot of Bach's library, ended up in Philadelphia, its earliest recorded, and then got sold and ended up in a attic in Michigan, I believe, and a Lutheran man was a pastor, I think from St. Louis, I may be getting my details wrong, was visiting his uncle in Michigan, and on the coffee table is one of these 3 volumes of this Calov's Bible commentary. And he opens it up and he sees J.S. Bach, or J.S.B., and he goes, no. And this is, I think, in the 30s or something. And so I think maybe Manies may have seen it. It's the Bibles of today are in Concordia behind glass, But it turns out, long story short, this man found that he had somehow, through his grandfather, inherited this Calov Bible commentary, in which Bach is handwriting. They verified it. He's writing in, I'll read you some of that. For instance, in Chronicles, he writes, this chapter is talking about the musicians and the music that we read about, Jehoshaphat and others, I believe. He says, this chapter is the true foundation of all church music pleasing to God. He goes on to say, a splendid proof that along with other institutions, the church service, music from the Spirit of God especially, was also ordained by David. And in devotional music service, God is always present with his grace. He would write in the margins these texts. He would underline them. He would write them. He wrote about Miriam and Exodus and underline and would write things in there, giving this illustration that despite what maybe liberal university scholars would tell you today, Bach was not just a professor that hat-tipped the cultural norms of the day, but that he was both a pious and a devout Christian. He was a Lutheran, as we well know. We need to pick up on this trait of not just being a grandson of the Reformation, but the trait here is simple. If we're going to see literacy return, before all that discussion can happen here, if we want to raise the next Bach in our churches, we've got to make sure that there are grandparents and parents whose shoulders that future greater Bachs can stand upon. What I mean by that is that maybe you feel overwhelmed at the prospect of returning to musical literacy in your home. Maybe you don't feel that you're equipped. But if we will simply commit ourselves to being a people of the Word, in song, in word, and in deed, then that's the first part of the equation right there. You don't have to know Neapolitan six chords, but you need to know the Psalms. You need to be able to sing them. You need to know that it's a direct correlation that we have Bach because he knew his Bible, because he was raised in classical Christian education. This is very important to bring out, and I don't think we can stress it enough. The other side of the coin, another way of looking at Bach might be to describe with Bach and in his life as we need to see in our own, is there's what I maybe need to refine this, but what I've described as faithfulness with a long view. Or another way maybe someone better would say is death and resurrection in the life of Bach. Bach didn't live in any sort of utopia, as you probably could imagine. He worked for both the court throughout his life and for the church, spending most of his years working for the church at Leipzig, at St. Thomas and St. Nicholas there, and in the school. But even in his latter years in Leipzig, he was met with more and more resistance to his compositions and practice. You can read stories and writings and public records of this, and really from 1730, the last 20 years of his life, he was reading from articles where colleagues were indirectly and overtly criticizing his seemingly passé style of writing, this new Rococo, new Enlightenment style that was coming to be popular. This was what he faced, and this strife was not any small thing there. But Bach possessed an understanding that his writings were not simply meant for his leaders, for the town council, but he wrote unto the Lord, as we know and see in his writings, both in his instrumental writings and in his vocal writings, that he would sign them SDG, Soli Deo Gloria. And that brings us to something I thought that would illustrate this point. If you've ever read or heard of the musical offering, the musical offering is one of the instrumental works by Bach that he wrote in the last 3 years of his life. And it's fascinating to me. If you've read the book Evening in the Palace of Reason, if you haven't, shame on you. No, just kidding. You should. It's lovely. It doesn't read like the musicologist wrote it for musicologists. It reads from, I believe, James Gaines, who I think was the Time or Life magazine editor at one point. Lived with his family in Paris. I think still it does today. And wrote this wonderful book, some of you have read it, where he, chapter by chapter, compares the life of J.S. Bach with Frederick the Great of Prussia. And he juxtaposes, I think, very keenly the life of Bach against Frederick. Bach being the old guard, and Frederick being the new enlightenment. Bach being the man who has gone through death and resurrection, and Frederick being a man who was basically in a common law, a meaningless marriage, living in a reprobate lifestyle. And he really does, between the lines, show you a clashing of worlds, a clashing of ideologies, but it doesn't read like he's preaching to you. It comes off the page as you chuckle and read. And so if you've not read it, I'll share a quote with you there. But it recounts this evening in May of 1747, when Bach is going to see his adult son, C.P.E. Bach, and who worked for Frederick the Great. He was his harpsichordist and musician there in Potsdam. And he went to see him. There was a new baby in the family, and he made the 2-day carriage ride and ended up there. Well, Frederick the Great hears of this and sends really a summons, more than an invitation, to Bach, to old Bach, as he called him, and others did too, to come and to the palace and see the new invention, the pianoforte, that he had, I think, 8 of, if I'm not mistaken. And anyway, long story short here, this musical offering came about because, unbeknownst to Bach, to J.S. Bach, Sebastian Bach, very likely, as Arnold Schoenberg thinks, and others have, I think, said that there's no reason to dispel this, that Frederick the Great was a musician. He played the flute in a gallant style, as Gaines points out. But Bach was summoned to write a fugue. And it's not sure exactly what's the origin here, and that maybe C.P.E., his son, was helpful in writing. As you know, a fugue is a theme or a motive that, if done and set up in a certain way, can be improvised on, can be added on, can be inverted, can be played, and built textures and layers in multiple voices. It's polyphony, right? It's multiple sounds at once. And so Bach comes before the court of other musicians in Frederick's court. He's invited to play on this instrument, and Frederick plays this instrument, this theme for him. I thought I'd put it up here so that you could see it. Hopefully it'll show here. This is the theme, the royal theme, as it's been called ever since. You see a lot of chromaticism in there. If you wanted to kind of see the solfege there, you've got a lot of walking down, and it just is I thought I'd sing it for you, but my voice is not there. But I'll play a little. Listen here. I'll sing maybe a little bit here. La, do, mi, fa, si, mi, re, di, do, ti, te, la, si, fi, mi, la, re, do, ti, la. Kind of weird, and if you study formal counterpoint, species counterpoint, Bach would have known something was up. And he did. But he still sat down and wrote a 3-part improvised fugue at the piano. Of course, the room was taken aback and waiting on the response of Frederick to see what would be said. And he said, Bach, old Bach, very well, very well. Could you do a 6-part fugue? As good tyrant might, up the ante, what can you say? Well, Gaines eloquently says that, he wouldn't have been faulted for turning it down. And he says, I can't do it justice that your majesty would deserve. So give me time and I will give it back to you, in essence, is what he said. And so he left him, and within 2 weeks, he returned to him a work via mail of fugues, canons, string, I believe, quartet, 6-part fugue that is glorious, if you've not ever heard it in the musical offering. And we don't know if you ever listened to it, but it's quite a work when you think about all the referential meaning that's been built into it. Michael Marison thinks that Bach did this to Frederick, and if you can go and read the preface, and he's writing to Frederick here and saying, this for you, for your majesty, and blah, 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 and going through, and you can just feel the sarcasm, and the dripping insincerity in the writing. Marison says he believes that Bach wrote this as a theological argument, almost as a parable of sorts. And we know parables that fools can't hear the meaning, right? It's a judgment on them. And that, my words, not Marison's, that there was a unique formal structure in there, a biblical structure you can read. And he talks about how he's trying to point him back to the Mosaic Law with maybe some underpinnings of all the things that Frederick was known to do that Bach would have disapproved of, but would never have had to say. He let his art speak. Others have said that no, it wasn't. Bach's instrumental work, the musical offering, was not a biblical rebuke of Frederick, but instead it was a legal argument, complete with an introduction and a proposition of and a narration and confirmation, the parts of a quintillion logic and Cicero's logic studies, that Bach would have studied this in a good classical education in his younger years and was using this. And some German scholars have laid, I believe, the movements side by side in a very convincing way. Whether that's true or not, we don't know. But would it be beyond Bach to do something like that? Absolutely not. But either way, the point for us here, and the point that he was able to do, is know and use his craft in such a way that he was able to take this music and really testify to God's goodness. So number one, he knew God, knew the scriptures in a robust way. He also knew the art form that he was working with, and I think he knew that he could get away with this, and maybe that no one would ever see it. I don't know that he did that expecting it to be a time capsule for us to see. Maybe, but maybe not. I want to read you something. Gaines really puts a bookend on this better than I can, and so if you'll bear with me. He says, whoever the royal theme may have been, whether it was C.P.E. Bach helping Frederick or Frederick did it himself, or some people said that it's similar to a work by Handel. But either way, the nature of it leaves no doubt that Frederick meant to give history's greatest master of counterpoint the most taxing possible challenge to his art. And it's easy to imagine that as his carriage rattled over the rutted roads from Potsdam back to Leipzig, Bach was already working out the puzzle Frederick had presented to him. Certainly, he had lost no time in working on it once he was back in Leipzig. At his composing desk in the southwest corner of the second floor of the St. Thomas School, the noise of the student dormitory barely muffled by a thin wall and the ad hoc installation of bookshelves heaped with music, he finished his musical offering to Frederick within a fortnight, turning the king's joke, if that's what it was, back upon him with all the force at his command. At the end of a long life spent practicing the art of conveying words in music, this was a great deal of force indeed. And the very quickness of Bach's work suggests how urgent the project was to him. In the end, it implicated the most dissonant themes in his life and in the king's as well. Among others, the proper relations between art and power, and the competition between fathers and sons. Perhaps most important, the work addresses the point of greatest conflict between these two men and one of the thorniest of all the issues raised by the Enlightenment. For the 18th century, and for its latter-day descendants, the role of belief in a world of reason. A work that may be read as a kind of last will and testament. Bach's musical offering leaves us, among other things, a compelling case for the following proposition: that a world without a sense of the transcendent and mysterious, a universe ultimately discoverable through reason alone, can only be a barren place, and that the music sounding forth from such a world might be very pretty, but it can never be beautiful. We may be grateful that Bach had spent a lifetime developing a musical language in which to say all that without fear of discovery or retribution, because his musical offering to Frederick represents as stark a rebuke of his beliefs and worldview as an absolute monarch has ever received. Not incidentally, it's also one of the greatest works of art in the history of music. And this was 3 years before his death, and there was, as I said earlier, there was no evidence that this was ever picked up and played by Frederick. Maybe his musicians were secretly interested in seeing what did Herr Bach do. with this supposedly word salad that, turtle and purple. Give us a haiku and rhyme it too, Wait a minute. Maybe that's what he was doing. Maybe they understood that. Maybe that's what it helps. And he turned it back on them with a force that we would do well to just take an inch of, or our grandkids. Chiefly, Bach wrote for an audience of one. I know that sounds cliche in our day, but that's really, really important. And that faith of Bach, that placement downstream from the Reformation, is very important. I think if we want to see musical literacy, we are on a fool's errand in the church if we do not promote and dedicate ourselves to being people of the Word, to sing it, to breathe it, to speak it. We know this. But music literacy will not thrive in the public arena when God is not honored and His Word is not honored. There is no reason to do it. Test scores don't move music literacy needles. No one changes the funding line for the arts based on some test score, anything real long-term. But if you're made in the image of God, if you've been made to sing, if you understand that you yourself are song, that you are a continuous melody, bouncing around by an ever-creative musician, then you'll persevere. Day 4 of music camp, singing the fugues and the Dona Nobis Pacem. You'll sweat. You'll work hard. That's why, for us, it just seems worth noting that without Bible, there is no music literacy. Without the church, this is our bastion. This is our entity. Music literacy and music education belongs to us. It does not belong to just some people that are interested in it. It's ours, and it's us who have to carry it, to promote it, use our buildings, take and support the musicians and the educators when the world does this only to their whim and their momentary desire. And so it comes and it goes. Another anecdote here that really brings this to light without belaboring the point is, you may have heard that it was Mendelssohn, as I said earlier, who gave us Bach. It was almost 100 years, if not exactly, that Mendelssohn's revival of Bach's Matthew Passion was performed with grandeur orchestra, and he was young. His grandmother, his Jewish grandmother, as you've probably heard me say, gave him a copy of the score. She had it written and performed, and he was fascinated. As German Jewish folks, they knew of Bach. Bach wasn't well known like he is today, but he was known. Mozart knew him, and others knew him. He was someone to be reckoned with if you were in that world. He didn't obviously have the name recognition that we see, but it was 100 years before a resurrection of sorts began to spring again. And what I wanted to talk with you about is the Suzuki. The Bach Collegium of Japan was started in 2000, I believe, where Masaki Suzuki, who is a reformed guy who went to go study in Amsterdam with Ton Koopman. If you've seen good Bach recordings, Ton Koopman is the harpsichordist who often plays, which was the practice, and not as much anymore, in front of the ensemble, either on the positive organ or on the harpsichord. And he accompanies in his bubbly, very animated. It's very fun to watch. He went and studied with this man and went back to Japan and came back and started this Bach Collegium. And First Things brought this to bear in an article by a correspondent, a Japanese-American, I believe, correspondent that lived in New York. And he wrote this article, and what he said was that the Bach's music has transformed life in Japan. There's been this trait of death and resurrection that has come from Bach's music. Bach's music went through a death and was forgotten. He was buried, dug up later. Now he's under the floor there in St. Thomas Church. His bones are. But he was forgotten relatively, and there was a time of quiet. There was a dormancy, but his music has been revived, and Bach's music was brought to the Japanese people, and it's fascinating. I thought I would share that with you as a reminder that Suzuki picked up on something. He said that Bach's music and the scriptures, the Matthew Passion particularly, brought about a curiosity the word hope. He says that what people in this situation in Japan he's writing about, he says, is they were looking for hope in the Christian sense of the word. But hope is an alien idea here, he says. He said, it's the driving force behind the Bach boom that Suzuki brought about in a time of what he calls spiritual impoverishment. He goes on to say, he says, our language does not even have an appropriate word for hope. We either use ibo, meaning desire, or nozomi, which describes something unattainable. And Suzuki says that after every one of the Bach Collegium's performances, Suzuki is crowded on the podium by non-Christian members of the audience who wish to talk to him about the topics that are normally taboo in Japanese society, death, namely, for example. And then they inevitably ask me to explain to them what hope means to Christians. And that's, I don't know, that's pretty impressive. Talk about longevity. Talk about faithfulness with a long view. Talk about putting and building into your work and the Lord blessing it. He goes on to say, I think worth noting here, that Suzuki, who is a member of the Reformed Church, makes sure his musicians, who are mostly non-Christians, he says, get that point. During rehearsal, he teaches them Scripture. It's impossible to say how many of my performers and listeners will ultimately become Christians. He believes, however, that Bach has already converted tens of thousands of Japanese to the Christian faith. Since 1990, he estimates anywhere from 100 to 200 other Bach choirs have popped up around the country. Not enthusiasts, choirs. 100 Bach choirs. Suzuki is even responsible for introducing the German word cantate, K-A-N-T-A-T-E, where we get our cantata, our sung work, into the Japanese vocabulary. In fact, he says it's a highly fashionable term, and his concerts are always sold out. In fact, the Bach Collegium has recorded all the vocal works of Bach. They've done so on period instruments, which that's no small feat in Japan. It's not like doing this in the middle of Europe, where you can find cathedrals and instruments that are relics of Bach's day. This is in Japan, mind you, where they're playing on period instruments. And he says people will pay, every Good Friday, more than 2,000 Bach enthusiasts will pay hundreds of dollars for a ticket to see the performance of St. Matthew Passion. He goes on to say, it's very moving to watch this enormous crowd follow the Japanese translation of the German lyrics word for word. And one of the scholars there also says, where else in the world would you find non-Christians so engrossed in biblical texts? I don't know that you would. So what does that mean for us? Well, these traits, really and truly, this has been my desire, is to see us not elevate Bach beyond what he would like, right? It's been said that his music is considered the fifth gospel, or some have said he is the fifth evangelist. And you would probably can imagine he wouldn't probably take kindly to that being said about his music. He would not want that attention, I suspect. But there's a reason we say that. There's a reason that Bach's music is seen that way. It's because there is a three-dimensional quality that is lost. There is a layered meaning that we must attain. I think it's all the more, given our cultural depravity these days, that we need to be more and more faithful and more skilled in understanding the Scriptures and bringing them to bear in layered meaning ways, because that may be the only way that we can testify without death for a time in a growing hostile society. How many times I remember being in the university and hearing us perform Lily Boulanger's setting of Psalm 24, which is a rousing 3/4. Dum, ta 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 dum, pa 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 bum 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 bum. The earth, the men start out tenors and basses. The earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof. And I was thinking, I looked around the room in one of the rehearsals, they were rehearsing the women, I thought, 60% of us are pagan, or homosexual, or just outright hostile to the gospel. And here we are, a whole bunch of thunderous rocks crying out, that God's praise is being emitted even by us, which if we said, can you sign off on this scripture passage, who would affirm it? And probably very few people would in that rehearsal. This may be our opportunity to testify to God's goodness in a growing more and more hostile society. Also, it may be our way of putting meaning in for generations to resurrect later. We've got to be Pastor Wilkins is good to remind us that the church has long been the conservatory of good art. And that's our call now, more so. When things are canceled because they trigger people, when they go to burning books, we've got to be the people that carry this along. The traits of this death and resurrection is no more evidence than in the life of Bach. And going back to the theme that Marison discussed back on the musical offering, I want to read you a quote that I think is very helpful. He says, Bach's stated intention of glorifying Frederick the Great appears incomprehensible if glorification is understood in the conventional manner. Bach's music seems here to project a rather different notion of glory. Far from elevating or shedding radiance and splendor on Frederick, the musical offering promotes a biblical Lutheran understanding of glory, one that Frederick cannot have found sympathetic, the idea of glorification through abasement, a view tied up with Luther's theology of the cross as opposed to a theology of glory. In the end, then, Bach's collection could act as a sort of general argument, not just for the different forms and styles of music, Bach's high Baroque, learned counterpoint rather than the gallant homophony and occasional gallant counterpoint of the Prussian court, but for decidedly different world and life views from those promoted by the French Enlightenment thinkers such as Frederick and others that followed after him. That I want to see that come about from my grandkids. I know you probably do too. I want to see other traits, service. Bach was known, and his choirs, his children's choirs. The model of literacy in Leipzig was that the boys sang. They sang for the church and the school. There was a more affiliation than we have today. But they sang, they performed concerts. As we've tried to do at Geneva, our boy choir, we've started a boy choir. Not because we don't like the girls, but because the girls, as I jokingly, close your ears, guys that are in that boy choir, the girls often are more quicker to say, yeah, I'll sing that. And the guys are not always as quick. And there's some great music, and we want these men with chests. We want these young men to love singing. We want them to love singing before their voices drop down to the floor, it seems. We want them to be able to project and to serve. Another thing that we can learn from Bach that I think would help us as things may grow hostile for us in our church community, in our school community, whereas in the name of, despite what we hear of tolerance, everything but Christianity is tolerated, then we may not be able to study with just any good music school professor. So what can we do? Well, what does the life of Bach bring to bear when it comes to music literacy? Well, apprenticing may be our way of doing. There may come a day when we can't grab degrees in music or masters and doctorates from schools that long were faithful to teach music training, even faithful and at one time in their heritage of being supportive of Christian education, being true liberal arts universities. Those days seemingly are gone. And so what will be our alternative for our students? Well, to find masters, skillful teachers, and apprentice with them. As we know, the scriptures admonish us that a student will be like his teacher. So we've got to, that may be our course of action. That may be why we do more of these. We do more private lessons. We become a conservatory when that may be the only thing that's available to us. But I, as I said at the beginning, I don't want to elevate Bach's life, but I do want you to see that there is a depth that we can't get to in this talk. I did not think that my contributions here would be that of musicology or exegeting musically. What I wanted to do is to kind of show you what it is that I find Bach helpful in. This thankfulness, this idea of the Bible being centric in Bach's writings, the idea of being death and resurrection incarnate in his music. Both you can read Calvin Stapert's Death and Discipleship in the Music of Bach, where you can hear him go through cantata and passion and oratorio music, where he brings it out line by line. The things we love so much about Bach, his ability to take, and we're starved for it whenever someone says something high, or when he sings the Kreutzer motive, or when he says Jesus is singing in a recitative, that it has an ornamented, elevated string accompaniment that is not there when the evangelist is singing. That three-dimensional quality is so valuable. That kind of thing Calvin Stapert brings out in such, I think, winsome ways to a culture that is not used to that. We're used to 3 chords, right? We're used to meaning that I can take in, chew through, and digest quickly. But what the glory of Bach is that his meaning is layered. And the great composers did that as well, as you well know. As John and David have brought forth in musical examples, that you can hear something and then hear it again and go, wow. So I would hope you would listen to the musical offering if you can. Go do that. Go listen to the Bach Collegium. Look up their work, Suzuki's work. It's not the Suzuki violin, not the same guy. I don't know this for a fact, but Suzuki seems to be the Smith equivalent in Japanese culture, at least it seems here. But I want to tell you that's where we're going. I've been thankful for our leadership and for the ability to, as Ed was joking with John Hodges, is all the stuff, the trouble I've gotten us in, music camp and getting David down here and his willingness to keep coming and coming back, and this Bach lectures and this psalm tap. And Ed's joking, he said, that's what we say yes to. Imagine the other stuff we're saying no to, Jarrod's bright ideas that come down the pipe probably every couple weeks. Pastor Steve, I think we could try this or we could try that. But my goal here is for us to do what I don't see others doing, to be joyful, musical, literate people, that where we don't know about music, but we can do music. So Bach is a great model for that, to bring Bach to the future, as Sarah helped me coin and you've seen. So I realize that you may either think, yeah, Jarrod, I agree perfectly fine. I don't disagree with what you said there. I would hope that in 10 years we do whole cantata in here, and we do music like that, that we can use that as a testimony to God's goodness, that we can say and use beauty to elevate one another in a time that who knows what it will look like. So you've been patient. I think what I'd like to do is, if you have any comments or questions, or and not just of me, of John or of David, I'm happy to. Since I invited them, I can say, come on up here and join me. But I'd love to just finish off for about 10 minutes with just, if you want to make a comment or a question. I didn't think you really needed me to speak to how many times a week we have music, and music literacy is like language and all of that good stuff. You can read about that elsewhere. But I thought just a reminder that Bach's life and his literacy, the literacy that we can glean from his traits, and there's plenty more that you could do, shouldn't be lost on us. I think the church would be, like I said, the chief of those, if you wanted to just drill down, is thankfulness. I think John might echo this, and definitely David, all for new music, but know what's come before, give thanks for it, then write new songs. So I think, thank you. This is not something I feel normally comfortable doing, so this may be the one and only shot you get to hear me up here. But if you have any comments or questions, John or David, please ask them a question. I'm going to yield my time. So why don't you guys come on up here and join me. Thank you. just stand up and speak up, and don't look at, David. He's probably doesn't want to be up here, but all right. Any comments or questions? Don't be shy. Michael. David?
You can take a shot at it.
Well, well, maybe you should answer that, because you're answering the...
Yes, that's a very good question.
What are we trying to do? That's your question.
So what are we trying to recover? We trying to, Michael asked, would Bach have seen a music camp similar to this, if I'm paraphrasing? Would just anyone be welcome? That's right. Yeah, so it wasn't just any child in the choir. Bach had levels. He had students who were gifted, right, David? You would echo this. But we beggars can't be choosers here. He also had, 1,000 years of singing God's songs and being musical, and everyone being that way where we don't have. We're in a desert. So would you add to that, or?
Yeah, well, I think you start to see in the Reformation there's an expansion of schooling. It's slow, to be sure, but with the Roman schools, it's more select. And there was a coveting of singers in that day, where when they would hear of a boy who was a great singer, wasn't it Josquin who was kidnapped?
Yes, that's right.
Josquin was kidnapped and brought down to sing in one of the, probably the papal choir in Rome, I think. So it was a big deal to have a great choir and have skillful singers. It was a very specialized thing and a very skilled thing. I think you see that changing in the Reformation, where education starts to become more and more broad. There's still those that are more skilled. Bach's best singers sang at the two bigger churches, and they did his bigger works. And then some of his assistants would take the boys who weren't very skilled, could only sing a melody, and they would sing at a smaller church, and that was all they did for their music with the choir there. So it's a growth. We're not trying to go back to Bach's day in that sense, but the idea that you can teach children literacy to sing that kind of music is what we want, and we want it more. We want it for more than a select choir. Again, you could go back to that day, and the people who learned to read and write in their native language was a very select, small group of people, a nobility that got that. Well, now all of our kids get that kind of a training. That's what we want for music. We want that to be the norm. And then on top of that, there's always going to be those that write more and write the books and write the poems and write the stories. And there are going to be the composers and the performers that are above the average. But we want the average to be like English is for us. We take that for granted, but you walk it back 300-400 years, and none of your kids are learning to read or write unless you happen to be one of the bigwigs in the town. So that's the vision, I guess I would say.
That's very good. You'd answer that, okay?
You can go first.
Well, as you know, I'm very interested in and supportive of the classical Christian movement. My my wife and I helped start Westminster Academy in Memphis, so 25 years ago, and they are going great guns. But one of the last things that got added to or put into place in that school was the music curriculum. And it's hard to do. We're building from scratch. We're sort of putting one stone on top of another and rebuilding the temple or the whatever, the building of our civilization. It took a few years even for the music program to get up and running. Now it's doing very well. And I think it should just catch fire in all of our classical schools. That would be, it's essential for all the reasons that you've heard from both of us, all three of us, today and yesterday. But it's not easy to find people that can do the work that's necessary. And so we rely on people like Dr. Erb here and the NSA program and the Kodai program that they're doing, and to train teachers to actually come and be able to do this kind of work. Should we show them your T-shirt here? There you go. There you go. And we need schools like the Geneva School here and all that Jarrod is doing here in order to pass that on to the next generation. So it's a multifaceted work, and it has to start basically from scratch. We're starting out, Here, don't misunderstand me. I'm not saying we're starting from scratch without knowing our history. We're bringing the practice of bringing all that historical stuff to bear on education and seeing music in its right way is the restoration in the musical world. You see, so to reconnect the faith with music and to understand our cultural moment is the work of any Christian in any day, I think, artistically. So I'm proud of these two fellows for what they're doing.
Just to piggyback on that, thanks for the advertisement. I was going to do that anyway, but you led me right to it, so it didn't look so egotistical. No, I think, with the direct question being, are we prepared if such a thing were to happen? And even if we don't get an influx, just dealing with our own communities, are we ready to lead that? Well, no, I don't think we're not ready for that. It's clear the church has lost so much, and so we're trying to recover, and we're doing the best we can. And there are outposts like going on here, because you have Jarrod here, that what's going on here is very unusual. There are some other places, it's happening in Moscow with teachers there, and some other places as well. Spokane, the Classical Christian School there with Kent Young. There's some places where there are skilled, musically trained people that have gotten this vision from the teaching of the faithful pastors in the CREC, and they're trying to work out the vision musically that has been poured out theologically. There's been a vision there. There's been some men that have come into our circles, our midst, and are trying to walk that out. But there are not a lot of places that I think have the skilled music teachers there, which is why we started the Chenaniah training school to train up Chenaniahs. Chenaniah was the leader of all the musical Levites because he was skillful. Not just because he loved the Lord. Well, he did that too, right? That's first. But he was skillful. That's why he was in that position. And we want to train up skillful teachers. And the encouragement we have seen is when I first met Jarrod back in 2011, I only remember because he told me a few hours ago, because I can never remember what year it was. When I met Jarrod in 2011, and we interacted with quite a number of music teachers in the ACCS, it was clear that there was not a readiness to go in this direction at all. And then, I don't know, about 4 years ago, we had another interaction with quite a number of music teachers in the ACCS, and there was a readiness. It's not that they were doing it all, but there was a readiness and an eagerness to learn, and we're seeing that around the ACCS, and so that's an encouragement. And we just still need to train them up, though, because to do the kinds of things we're talking about, we can't rely on forever moms who took piano till the time they were 18 and sang in a choir for 3 years somewhere along the way, and they are the music teacher K through 12 for the next 30 years. And if they are, bless them for filling the gap and doing what no one else is able to do. But that's not our model. As we teach, a student would be like his teacher, and the first law of teaching is that a teacher knows his subject. We teach that, we say that, we have to then find those teachers, we have to train them up, and that's what we're hoping to do as God brings people for us to teach. So we're thankful for the growth in that.
Any other comments? Well, this has been loads of fun. Anybody else? Going once, twice? Well, you've been kind. Thank you for putting up with me to close the evening. Let's stand, we'll pray, and we'll be dismissed. Thank you. Our Father in God, we thank you for your great mercies to us. Thank you for the ability to get together. Thank you for preserving us this week. Thank you for this upcoming concert and the ability to enjoy it and the fellowship that it brings because we're here together through the week. Thank you for the students and for the faculty and for John and David and all of our presenters at the Psalm Tap. I ask that you would continue to stir a love of music in your church, that you would use it to bring people to yourself, that you would cause a love and a curiosity in this community that we would be able to be a part of, and that we would be faithful in it. Give us good rest tonight as we prepare for the final day of camp and the concert on Saturday. Those that travel tomorrow, we ask that you would protect them, bring them back home. Give us the ability to remember what we've discussed here, the friendships that we've kindled, and that we'd be able to move forward and refreshed for the callings that you've put upon us, not least of which is singing and encouraging one another in song. So bless us this night as we depart, and we thank you in Jesus' name. Amen. Thank you all.